I'd like to introduce our speaker this morning, John Clayton. And no one is better suited to kicking off the conference than RedLodge-based author, historian, and storyteller John Clayton. He'll orient us to the town and the region with striking photos and colorful stories from his 2008 book, Images of America, RedLodge. He'll also bring in insights and engaging tales learned from researching and writing about this region for more than 30 years. John's 2019 book, Natural Rivals, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and the Creation of America's Public Lands, was featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books, and on NPR's On Point. His 2017 book, Wonderlandscape, Yellowstone National Park and the Evolution of an American Cultural Icon, was a Montana Book Award honor book and winner of the High Plains Book Award. He also authored Stories from Montana's Enduring Frontier, a collection of his essays on Montana history, and The Cowboy Girl, about the life of Montana and Wyoming novelist, journalist, and homesteader Caroline Lockhart. John's first book, Small Town Bound, was featured in Time and Harper's magazines and on the Today and Oprah Winfrey shows. Please join me in the warm welcome for John Clayton.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks to Molly and Christine and Renan and everyone who's been organizing this conference. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And thanks to Fryer, our chef, and his staff. This is really a nostalgic moment for me. When I first arrived in RedLodge 32 years ago, one of my first jobs was as a waiter for events like this here in what was then a brand new facility. So it's fun to be back here in a different context. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about RedLodge history so that you can be situated. I am not necessarily the world's leading expert on RedLodge history. I just happened to write a book about it and was willing to stand up and talk about that book. But Alan Shelpate, who is sitting up front here, grew up in RedLodge. Trouty Perry, who's sitting up here, is a former district ranger here in RedLodge. I believe I saw Linda Dutcher somewhere. Long RedLodge history. Patty Hooker Molinaro from the museum knows a lot of history, so there are plenty of opportunities for you to talk to more people about RedLodge history. Okay, well, let's get started then. Let's see how. Oh, good, the technology is working. So this is Crow country. This area was once part of the Crow Reservation. Before white people decided that there needed to be reservations, this land was nurtured by Crows and Shoshones and members of other tribes as well. The flight of the Nez Perce was about 10-15 miles east of here, and of course they had come through Yellowstone on the Bannock Trail, implying that Bannocks and other tribes from west of the divide came through this area to access bison herds just east of here. This is a statue of Plentycoo, the Crow chief. It sits at the Chamber of Commerce building at the north end of RedLodge. We RedLodge residents like to think that we have fondness and appreciation of Crow history and culture. On the other hand, this is a statue by a white sculptor sitting at a white-run Chamber of Commerce in a white-dominated community. To all records, Lyle Johnston did a great job with this sculpture. It's an authentic representation of Plentycoo. But is it really how Crow people see themselves today? Is it how the Crow people want their culture to be recognized by the current white residents of RedLodge? I think those are really important questions, and they're questions that I am not qualified to answer as another white person. But one of the people who is really qualified to answer that is Shane Doyle, who will be speaking tonight. I know I'm really looking forward to Shane's talk. Shane's a great historian and wonderful individual. So we'll get more Crow perspective from Shane. How did Red Lodge get its name? That's a question that lots of people have, and the short answer is we don't really know. This is the text of a historic sign that used to exist along the river south of Red Lodge. It has been destroyed by the June floods, but it suggests that lodge refers to Indian teepees that were somehow painted red. Little bit of a puzzle, there's not a lot of red rock around here, so where did the red color come from? We don't really know. There are some theories that perhaps the red is blood, and I've heard this story both ways. Maybe there was a Shoshone village that was destroyed by crows, and it was Shoshone blood on the teepees, or maybe it was a Crow village that was destroyed by Shoshones. It depends on who's telling the story. But the lodges probably refer to the teepees of the indigenous people who were here before the whites. Once the whites arrived, Red Lodge was a coal mining town. Coal discovered here in the 1880s or so, and the coal boom lasted from the 90s into the 1920s. This is a picture of the main city of Red Lodge, and we're standing on the east bench looking west towards the ski area. Of course, no ski runs yet on top of that mountain. But we're looking across the downtown, and you see the three smokestacks there in the middle from the west side mine. And then you see over here the industrial buildings of the east side mine. So there were two mines on opposite sides of the valley from downtown. Opposite, we call them benches, the east and west bench. And so those mines employed all the people in town. So it was a very industrial setting. A lot like Butte, a little bit different than a lot of Montana. You have a pretty densely populated downtown region. Lots of pedestrian scale architecture. Lots of immigrants coming sometimes directly from the old country in Europe to work in the mines if they had expertise or experience in that, and tending to settle in ethnic neighborhoods, much like Butte, much like cities in the east, a little bit different than a lot of Montana areas. So I live right downtown. I live in Finntown. The Finns were the biggest ethnic group. We still have Finn Park, one of the city parks, named after the Finnish community that lived there. Just north of me is Little Italy. Little Italy did not get its streets paved until the 1990s. I don't know if that's anti-Italian sentiment or not. By the second half of the 20th century, there was some mixing of the ethnicities. There are still a few Finns in Finntown, but now it's a little more heterogeneous. Another shot of the downtown. Now we're on the west bench looking east, and so these three smokestacks that we saw earlier are here on this side of the valley now. And you can see a big slack pile over by the east side mine. What I find particularly interesting about this picture is the tipple. So the coal would come out and be put on these conveyors here, and then be dropped into the trains that would run right through the middle of town. So where the Cafe Regis was about where the end of this tipple is here, and the trains would head out to the north. There was also a spur going over to the east side mine. So, coal was really the purpose of this town. And coal was why the trains were here. Coal was why the people were here. And coal was why all these houses were built in somewhat haphazard fashion, but again at a very pedestrian scale. And the downtown was built at that time in a pedestrian scale, and Red Lodge is very proud of its historic downtown, and this picture, perhaps from the 1890s or early 1900s, shows that that downtown with many of these buildings are still standing today. Backed, of course, by Mount Maurice. Back then you had dirt streets, you had the horse-drawn carriages instead of cars, you had board sidewalks, but you had that classic architecture that people here really still love. So when you're downtown during your weekend, look especially for some of these architectural detailings. You will still see some of these buildings. By the way, almost all of these pictures that I'm showing come from the Carbon County Historical Society Museum. Some of you were there last night at the reception. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. Delightful institution that collaborated with me on this Images of America RedLodge book. And so, be sure to get some of their expertise. This is a great picture because we've got, because of the people who are in it. I believe this individual here is, I always forget which one is which. We have Buffalo Bill Cody in this picture, and we have the painter Frederick Remington in this picture. And yet for RedLodge people, of course, the most important figure in this picture is the dog. RedLodge, a great dog town. One of the big figures in RedLodge history is Liv Reeton Johnston. He was the town's first constable in the mid-1890s. That's him on the right here with an unidentified man on the left. One of the few authenticated pictures of John Johnston. Of course, as most of you probably know, there was, the Robert Redford movie was basically fiction. He probably never actually ate anyone's liver. It was simply a legend that arose around him. But as he aged, he took more standard jobs rather than just being sort of a mountain man. He was a lawman in Colson, which later became Billings, and then he came up to RedLodge, homesteaded just south of RedLodge, and served as constable. When he left RedLodge in the late 1890s, he got on a train, went to Los Angeles to a veterans hospital. He was very sick, and he died there 6 months later or so. Funny sort of coda to that, in the 1970s, some high school kids in Los Angeles discovered that his grave was right next to a freeway. It didn't feel like a very Western place. They called up people in RedLodge to ask if we might want to host his grave. They also called some people in Cody, and there became this war between RedLodge and Cody as to who would get Liv Reeton Johnston's grave, and Cody won. But our argument was that Cody didn't really exist in his lifetime. He loved RedLodge. RedLodge is sort of the spirit of freedom of those mountain men still exists here. I love this picture. I don't know a lot about it, but these costumes are just fantastic. They're clearly posed. Is it Halloween? Is it some sort of preparation for a formal ball? I don't know why these people are dressed so entertainingly, but it sure is entertaining. And another cool thing, this is probably in the Snag Bar, which still exists downtown and still has this gorgeous back bar. This is also a fun photo for the ceiling, the tin ceiling. A lot of people in RedLodge are proud of our historic interiors as well as exteriors. And I was surprised to learn in researching this book that tin ceilings in the 1890s or through the 1910s and 20s were not really all that admired. It was not particularly elegant. It was a cheap, mass-manufactured way of constructing a ceiling. It was sort of the 70s paneling of its day. but many of the tin ceilings downtown have been well preserved, and so I encourage you to not only admire the architecture outside those buildings, but inside as well. This is one of the famous buildings downtown. People often ask about it. The Theatorium, located directly behind the Pollard Hotel, built in 1920 as a huge theater for both live performances and movies. Those of you who were at the Roman last night recall that the Roman was built in 1917 and remains the oldest continuously operating theater in Montana. And yet RedLodge was so booming with coal that 3 years later they opened this competing theater. There was also the Park Theater, which is now the Candy Store. But this one was going to be the biggest and best of them all. And yet 2 years later, 1922, the East Side Mine closes. 2 years after that, the West Side Mine closes. Coal mining continued in Bear Creek for another few decades. But really, the Theatorium was the last great sort of mark of the height of the RedLodge coal boom. And so it closed within a few years of its opening. Later it was turned into a distillery, and then after World War II it became a sort of a repair garage, and that's when it acquired these garage front doors. There are ramps inside. It would take a lot of work to restore it back to a theater, and at that point then there would be no parking. So it has been spiffed up. This is a picture from the 1980s, and they've done some nice restoration work since then on the exterior. So you can walk past and admire it, and if you have a great deal of money and time, I think you could come and help us restore it. Another classic building in RedLodge is the Pea Cannery, a big, tall brick building on the northeast edge of town. And believe it or not, RedLodge was a center of peas. And indeed, this lasted through the 1970s. I occasionally run into people from RedLodge or Billings who worked a summer in the Pea Cannery back in perhaps the 1970s. And so the peas were grown all over the region and managed in this incredibly complex way that I can't believe they did without computers. Down in, say, Forsyth, it gets warmer earlier. The peas ripen in early midsummer, and they would truck them up to the cannery in RedLodge. And then they would sort of march up in elevation as the summer went on and finally harvest the peas in this area late in, say, September, and be able to keep the cannery running consistently through the summer months. It was independently owned from when it opened in about the 1920s through into the 1960s when it sold to a conglomerate. And the RedLodge peas brand was well known, and lo and behold, it continued after this cannery closed. So some of those peas were not really RedLodge peas. And that cannery is, that old building, first built as a brewery, then operating for many years as the cannery, is now being restored as a sort of artist center. I don't know a lot of details about that, but it is an exciting example of current historic preservation. Many of you may know RedLodge for the Festival of Nations, which was one of the big cultural touchstones for this community through the second half of the 20th century. The way we like to tell the story, when the mines closed, all of these ethnic neighborhoods, all the people wanted to stick around. They loved RedLodge, they loved the area, the outdoor opportunities. Some people certainly moved away for jobs, perhaps mining jobs in Butte or elsewhere, perhaps other opportunities. But the ones who stayed really wanted to stay, and yet they found themselves increasingly isolated And after World War II, they thought about, well, let's go ahead and celebrate our diverse ethnic cultures. Let's do it all together in a week-long celebration, and we'll have one night for the Slavs and one night for the Germans and one night for the English, et cetera, et cetera. And so they got together and had this Festival of Nations with ethnic dancing and food, a celebration for the community, which also turned out to have great appeal for tourists as well. When I arrived in RedLodge in 1990, it was a week or two later that I was asked to join the German dancing band, despite the fact that I am not German and definitely cannot dance. It was a real community spirited event. Bonnie Christensen's book, RedLodge, came out about 20 years ago, and she suggested that it was a little more strategic than that. Perhaps the Chamber of Commerce in the 1940s noticed that ethnic festivals were popular in other places and helped encourage this as tourism rather than solely as a sort of community spirit type event. But even so, it was a way, it was very much of an event that people collaborated on, that the community came together to put on, sort of like White Sulphur Springs today supports the Red Ants Pants Festival. The Festival of Nations was a 1940s through 1990s version of that, and again, a set of communities that hadn't really necessarily collaborated previously. The Finns used to have their own grocery store, their own social clubs, their own newspapers. You know, there were Finnish newspapers in my house when I remodeled it. After the festival, people were willing to collaborate more, such as the Germans asking me to dance. RedLodge has some fascinating dude ranching heritage. I just love this era of history. This is Camp Senia up the West Fork. You can't get there now. The floods knocked out some of the bridges. But back in the 19-teens, Al Kroonquist here in the middle started a camp that where people could come and primarily go fishing. And Al, with his Finnish heritage, would build log cabins in the Finnish style with the logs all squared off until he discovered that the tourists really preferred the rustic style with the rounded logs. And he named it after his wife, Senia Polari Kroonquist, who was his full partner in this and did a lot of the food. Al's staff would stock the lakes and build the trails for the dudes to get up there. So if you have ever fished Timberline or Gertrude Lakes or Sennel or Dude Lakes, it is the staff of Camp Senia that you can thank for the stocking the fish that you caught there. The other cool thing about this photo is Al Kroonquist's daughter here, then known as Mabel Kroonquist. After she got married, she took her mother's name, and some of you may have known her as Senia Hart, the Billings philanthropist associated with I believe she was associated with the Hart Albin department store in Billings. Senia was living in RedLodge in the 1990s, and I remember running into her on the sidewalk, and she said, "I think you'd be really interested in dude ranching, and I've got some cool old pictures to show you." She was right, but I didn't figure it out for about 15 years. And luckily, her daughter, Eliza McClelland, provided some pictures that we were able to include in the Images of America book. RedLodge is a big rodeo town. These are the fighting Lindermans. There were actually 5 Linderman brothers in total. Bill in the center here, probably one of the greatest rodeo cowboys of all time. The Rodeo Association still gives away the Bill Linderman Trophy every year. The brothers grew up in incredible poverty over by Belfry and were thus sort of the crusty Montanan type of rodeo star. as I said, known as the Fightin' Lindermans, as opposed to the Ridin' Greenos, another great rodeo family. This is Alice Greeno, shown competing, I believe this is here in the RedLodge rodeo in the 1930s or 40s. Alice and her siblings were also champions, and so between the champion Lindermans and the champion Greenos, that's why RedLodge is the home of champions rodeo. I'm a particular fan of Alice because in addition to being a rodeo competitor, she then became a stunt woman, she became a contractor, she was really a wonderful business person throughout her life. One of the, I think number 79 on the list of top 100 influential Montanans. She was also a collector, and her collection of artifacts was what began the Carbon County Historical Society Museum. So Alice Greeno, real hero of Red Lodge and Montana history. Alice's father was Packsaddle Ben Greeno, given that name by Liv Eaton Johnson in the 1890s. Packsaddle Ben was later a figure skating champion in Montana. Sort of neat little piece of trivia. And one of Alice's champion brothers was Turk Greeno. And Turk became somewhat of a celebrity in the 1940s, especially when he married the fan dancer Sally Rand. This picture from their wedding in Glendora, California. I didn't know what a fan dancer was when I was writing this book, and it turns out that she would dance with a fan and not much else. It was big news when this close to stripper from California decided to marry the rodeo star and move and become a rancher in Montana. Alas, the marriage did not last, but Turk went on to become a much-loved figure. He later moved to Las Vegas and was sort of a greeter at the casinos. Died only maybe 20 years ago, but another great example of Red Lodge history. Of course, many people know Red Lodge history for the Beartooth Highway into Yellowstone, constructed in the 1930s. Actually not a Depression-era sort of job-making project, as many people think. It was the political effort to establish it happened in the 1920s after the coal mines closed, as Red Lodge was looking for a new form of economic support. How about we have a road that will go to the Cook City mines? When that didn't really seem to pan out, well, how about we have a road that will go into Yellowstone Park? The mayor of Red Lodge, JCF Siegfried, was a tireless promoter of this idea and eventually convinced the federal government to build this road and to plow it, which was especially difficult using the equipment they had back in the 30s and 40s, as we see here. It continues to be difficult to plow. As you may have heard, the road closed 24 minutes ago. Because of this storm, will probably be snow up top. This is a sort of new thing for the state to be doing, preemptively closing the road in the shoulder season when storms are approaching so that you won't drive up there and get stuck. Probably a good idea on their part. We can hope that the road will reopen next week if the snow doesn't prove too heavy, but this is about the time when Red Lodge starts realizing that it is a community at the end of the road rather than just a gateway to Yellowstone. On that highway, this is a shot of Beartooth Lake with Beartooth Butte behind it, and we see one of the Yellowstone buses there in the front. Many of you, I think, were at the reception last night at the Buses of Yellowstone Preservation Trust building, a wonderful historic preservation initiative here in Red Lodge. Another fascinating thing to me about this picture, if I have time, you see a little butte here in front of the big Beartooth Butte. This was a promotional photo from the Northern Pacific Railroad, and it referred to this as the Bear's Tooth. Those of you who have driven the road probably recall a sign in front of a very different mountain saying that that one is the Bear's Tooth. And it made me realize that they built a road through the Beartooth Mountains and they just decided to name various tooth-like structures as bear's teeth. Which means, obviously, these things weren't visible before they built the road. How did these mountains get their name, Beartooth Mountains? Was there some specific promontory that was the Bear's Tooth before the highway was built? To me, a perhaps unanswerable question, but something maybe you guys can debate. And then my final slide is another one from the top of the highway that RedLodge likes to claim, and this is just so funny. From the 1940s or so into the 1980s, once a year, the RedLodge Chamber of Commerce would run the Top of the World bar up by Long Lake on top of the Beartooth Pass. And so if you were driving along the Beartooth Pass, there would be this place where you could get a free drink before you drove down the switchback. They carved it out of snow just because that was something, something to do. This, you can see, is from 1981. This continued into the fairly recent past. And, they would never announce ahead of time which day they were going to do it. They would just, the Chamber of Commerce leaders would get up early in the morning, stop by all the bars, grab all of their extra bottles of booze and take them up to the pass. The reason they couldn't announce it is because if they did, all the RedLodge people would come up and drink the free drinks. But in this year, 1981, they had the See 'em Alive Zoo here in RedLodge, had an elephant. And they said, yeah, let's bring the elephant up to the top of the pass. You can't see it in this picture, but I believe this was the year they painted it pink. Sort of a gruesome thought of how to treat animals these days. But to me, this captures the spirit, a sort of irreverence that I've always loved about RedLodge. A bunch of people who take great joy in the wonderful place where we live and the opportunities for outdoor recreation that it gives us, and perhaps try not to take ourselves too seriously. And so having fun in the Beartooths is what I like to think RedLodge is all about. So that concludes the slides that I had. I don't know how we're doing on time. Do we have time for questions or comments? Do other people have stories? Yeah.
Your talk has inspired me to discuss the name of RedLodge.
Ah, great. Can I give you the microphone?
In the Burlingame Archives at the University of Bozeman, there are the memoirs of Walter Cooper, and many of you know who Walter Cooper was. He was a blacksmith and prominent citizen in Bozeman. And they haven't always been there because the memoirs were in a box at the Museum of the Rockies for a long time, and finally the museum decided to turn them over to the Burlingame Archives. But at any rate, in his memoir, Walter Cooper talks about leading groups over here when RedLodge was still on part of the Croat reservation, either hunting or keeping his eye on the coal seams that could be seen actually from a long distance. And he later made a claim on those. But anyway, he talks about coming up a creek northwest of Rock Creek, a tributary of Rock Creek. And one day when he was coming up there was a teepee that had red coloration on it. And an Indian woman came out of that teepee and waved him away. So he said, he talks about taking a wide berth around that teepee, and then after that he said, I named that unnamed creek RedLodge Creek. And then he talks about how proud he is of the fact that when the town developed, they took that name RedLodge from the creek that he had named.
Excellent. Thank you, Linda. Other stories or questions or additions? Patty Hooker from the Historical Museum.
I have other stories about the naming of RedLodge. There are also other stories of the naming of RedLodge that the Crow tribe has. So if anyone's further interested, please stop at the museum because that may be one of them, but there's a tribute to the Crow in that stories as well. It's too long to tell now.
Thanks, Patty. Other comments, stories, questions?
I'd like to know if anybody else besides us were lucky enough to get to the bar in the early 80s.
Any other visitors to the Top of the World bar from the early 80s? Raise your hands. Yeah, we've got a few. Well done. Yes.
Your picture of the pea cannery reminded me that my father, who worked there one summer, would never eat canned peas.
Excellent. Anything else? Well, what a thrill it's been for me to talk about the town that I love. I really appreciate you guys listening to me drone on here. I hope you enjoy your stay in RedLodge. Please talk to some of these experts that know a lot of RedLodge history. Please enjoy yourselves. Please let me know if there's any other questions or anything else I can offer you. Thanks.